one of the core things, which is to manage responsibly our fiscal position so that we can support the vulnerable in society, so we can move forward as a society. So we need to spend less and invest more as a country.
Canada's budget watchdog is out with a new report saying he expects the upcoming fall budget to reveal a sharp increase to the annual deficit.
This year, it rings in at $78.3 billion, well above the $42 billion deficit in the 2024 fall economic statement.
This isn't just a history lesson. This is a forensic audit of every Canadian Prime Minister's budget, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau, to uncover the truth about Canada's economic story and who is really responsible for the financial realities that we face today. Decades of budgets, trillions in spending, and a trail of promises, some kept and some broken, because for generations, Canadian Prime Ministers have stood in Parliament, held up a budget, and sold us their vision for the country's finances. They've all promised prosperity, fiscal prudence, and a better future for Canadians. Every few years, Canadians tune in to the same ritual where the finance minister rises, the cameras are rolling, and a new budget is unveiled. Then you get new slogans, new numbers, like generational investment, middle-class growth, building the economy of tomorrow. But today, with the cost of living at a boiling point and the Canadian dream feeling more distant than ever, you have to ask yourself what really happened, who actually delivered, and who just passed the bill to the next generation. The answers, it turns out, are buried in the numbers, and what they mean for your wallet right now is staggering. So we decided to find out about this topic this time, and I wanted to wait until the very end of this monologue. And if you get any value from this video this time, please click on the subscribe button and let's get into it. Our story starts in 1968 with Pierre Trudeau, who came to power at the tail end of a post-war boom, a time of incredible national confidence.
It is an extremely great honor that I have received from this great assembly of Liberals, an honor and a very heavy responsibility. And the only way in which I can show my appreciation for this honor.
His vision for Canada wasn't just ambitious, it was unapologetically bold. It wasn't just managing a country, it was building a just society. And his budgets reflected just that. This was the era of massive expansion of the Canadian social safety net. We saw new programs created and old ones broadened, from unemployment insurance to family allowances. Trudeau's government poured money into infrastructure and national institutions, shaping the modern identity of Canada till date. But this ambition came at a steep price. When Pierre Trudeau took office, the federal debt was a manageable $18 billion. But by the time he left office in 1984, it had exploded to nearly $200 billion. The debt-to-GDP ratio at the time, a key measure of a country's financial health, shot up from 24% to 46%. The annual deficit, which was just over $500 million when he started, had ballooned to a shocking $37 billion by 1984. Now, the world was turbulent. Oil shocks and stagflation, the nasty mix of high inflation and high unemployment, were battering Western economies at the time, and Canada was no exception. But the Trudeau government's answer was almost always to spend more. The philosophy was clear. Government was the engine for social progress. He left behind a robust social state, we must give him that credit, but also a fiscal hole that would define Canadian politics for the next 30 years. His successor would inherit not just the Prime Minister's office, but a balance sheet flashing bright red. Brian Mulroney and his progressive Conservatives swept into power in 1984 with a completely different message.
I today, sir, as a Canadian, believe genuinely in what I am doing. I believe it is right for Canada. I believe that in my own modest way, I am nation building because I believe this benefits Canada and I love Canada.
Inheriting Trudeau's deficit, Mulroney declared that Canada was living beyond its means. His promise? To rein in spending, restore fiscal sanity, and make Canada more competitive, his government introduced policies that were transformative and deeply controversial. They privatized crown corporations like Air Canada, arguing government shouldn't be in the business of running businesses. They dismantled the old Foreign Investment Review Agency, sending a signal to the world that Canada was open for business. But Mulroney's two biggest economic moves were tectonic shifts in Canada. First, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, a massive gamble he argued was essential for our long-term prosperity. And second, and maybe the most politically costly move of his career, was replacing the hidden manufacturer's sales tax with a very visible goods and service tax, the GST. Economists argued it was smarter tax, but for Canadians, it was a new tax on almost everything, and it made Mulroney's government wildly unpopular. So, did he slay the deficit? The reality is even more complicated than that, because despite trying to control program spending, that massive debt left by the Trudeau years meant interest payments were exploding. While the government did manage to turn an operating deficit into an operating surplus, meaning it was taking in more than it was spending on programs, the overall debt kept climbing because of those crushing interest costs. Mulroney's era was a painful, necessary rewiring of the Canadian economy. He didn't fix the debt problem, but it fundamentally changed the government's approach, setting the stage for the dramatic showdown to come. Then by 1993, Canada was on the brink. The Wall Street Journal had famously called Canada an honorary member of the Third World because of our spiraling debt at that time. The country's credit rating was at risk. Into this crisis stepped the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien with his finance minister Paul Martin. Their first promise was modest, just get the deficit down to 3% of GDP. But by 1995, with markets losing confidence, they declared an all-out war on the deficit. Paul Martin's 1995 budget is arguably the most consequential in modern Canadian history. It was a brutal reckoning.
I always enjoy talking. I believe that one of the great systems is to make yourself very available. You take some risk.
The government unleashed deep cuts that sliced through almost every federal department. The biggest move was a massive reduction in transfers to the provinces that funded healthcare, education, and social assistance. In just a few years, federal program spending as a share of the economy was slashed massively. For Canadians, the impact was severe. Cuts to provincial transfers led to hospital closures, big-size classes, and frayed social services. It was a period of real pain, and Martin and Chrétien were accused of balancing the books on the backs of the most vulnerable Canadians. But the results were impossible to deny. In 1998, for the first time in nearly 30 years, Canada tabled a balanced budget. What followed were 5 straight surpluses, and for the first time in a generation, the government started to pay down the national debt. Canada's debt-to-GDP ratio, which had peaked at a nearly 70%, was finally on a steady downward path. The Chrétien-Martin year were a fiscal revolution to Canada. They took a country nearing a debt crisis, through politically painful choices, forced it back into the black. That fiscal dividend allowed them to reinvest in social programs and cut taxes in their later years in office, but the scars of the 90s cuts run deep. The debate over how they did it continues even to this day. When Stephen Harper's Conservatives took office in 2006, they inherited an incredibly strong fiscal position.
Friends, great things are only accomplished by many people working together. La politique est un sport d'équipe. Politics is a team sport. It's always what I've said, and it's true. For Lorene and I, there's one thing that has always been clear. We can always count on our home team, the Riding Association of Calgary Southwest.
The budget was balanced and the economy was humming. Harper's promise was one of steady, prudent management and lower taxes. His mantra was simple: lower taxes, less debt, and disciplined spending. One of his first and most popular moves was cutting the GST, first from 7% to 6% and then to 5%, putting money directly back into consumers' pockets. His government also continued to lower corporate taxes, aiming to make Canada a magnet for investment. But in 2008, the world changed. The global financial crisis hit, plunging economies into a deep recession. After some initial hesitation, the Harper government pivoted from pure fiscal conservatism to stimulus. Along with other G7 nations, Canada rolled out billions in infrastructure spending and support for key industries to keep the economy from sinking. Compared to many of our peers, Canada weathered the storm really well in 2008. Our banking system proved resilient and the stimulus cushioned the blow, but it meant a return to deficits. The debts, which had been falling before, started to climb again. But once the immediate crisis passed, the Harper government refocused on balancing the budget through spending restraints, and they just managed to get back to surplus before leaving office. The Harper era was one of pragmatism over grand vision. His government successfully navigated the worst global economic crisis since the Great Depression, maintained a lower tax burden, and ultimately returned the books to balance.
We have created the lowest tax environment for business investment across the G7. That's one of the reasons we have the strongest employment growth in the G7. We cut taxes not just for big business, but we cut taxes many times for small business, and the NDP voted against that every single time. The reality is, not only did these tax cuts help create jobs, but our tax revenues actually went up from the business sector. We've done the same thing for people. We have cut taxes across the board, with a vast bulk of those tax breaks for middle and low-income Canadians.
Critics argue his post-crisis austerity slowed the recovery, but it left the nation's finances on solid ground. In 2015, Justin Trudeau came to power with a totally different message.
This is what positive politics can do. This is what a positive, hopeful vision and a platform and a team together can make happen.
He argued that modest deficits were a good thing, a way to invest in Canadians. The era of austerity was over, a return to big government had begun. The promise was to invest in social programs, infrastructure, and the middle class, arguing that growing the economy from the heart outward was the real path to prosperity. The deficits that followed were anything but modest. Even before the pandemic began, the Trudeau government significantly increased spending on a wide range of programs, from a new child benefit to major investments in climate initiatives. Then in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic unleashed the largest fire hose on government spending in Canadian history. The result has been a historic pileup of debt. The gross federal debt, which included all federal liabilities, surged past the $1 trillion mark for the first time ever during the pandemic. So between 2015 and his first 7 years in office, per person federal spending grew by over 30%, even excluding the most COVID-related spending. It took a century and a half for Canada to accumulate its first $616 billion in debt, but the Trudeau government doubled it in less than a decade. Supporters argue this spending was essential, first to stimulate a slow economy and then to prevent a societal collapse during the pandemic. They point to new programs like dental care as generational investments that improve well-being. However, critics see a government with no fiscal anchor and no restraints. They point to lagging economic growth compared to the US and argue these massive deficits are fueling the very inflation and affordability crisis the government says it's fighting in the first place. That promise of smart economics is seen by some as just political cover for reckless spending.
This is roughly how much money Canada's federal government owed as of last year. Was nearly $1.2 trillion. If you've ever thought having like $10 million or even $100 million would be life-changing. That is more than $1 million.
And this is the reckoning. The expansion of the social safety net under the second Trudeau mirrors the ambition of the very first Trudeau. But it's happening in a world of much more higher debt and slower growth than the first time. The affordability crisis, the struggle to buy a home, the rising cost of groceries, this is the front line where 50 years of budget decisions have finally landed us as Canadians. And now with Mark Carney stepping into the spotlight, the question is whether Canada is entering a new chapter or simply rewriting the old one.
Well, creating literally hundreds of thousands of high-paying careers from the skilled trades to advanced technology. And the budget will make these generational investments while maintaining Canada's strong fiscal advantage by taking responsible, pragmatic choices.
Carney's administration could be a perfect mirror image of Brian Mulroney's. However, his first budget promises responsible investment in green growth, in housing, and in productivity. The language sounds prudent, but the pattern is familiar. You spend now, balance later. Markets see a credible technocrat. Critics see continuity in deficit culture. But whether Carney can restore fiscal anchors or merely polish them will define the next decade of Canada's economic story. Half a century of budgets later, the verdicts show up not in spreadsheets anymore, but in pay stubs. Real wages have barely grown. Home ownership feels out of reach for many. Taxes swallow a larger share of income than housing or food. The national debate over deficit and investment isn't abstract anymore. It's written into our grocery bill, into the rent prices, and the quiet ambition of a generation wondering if they'll ever get ahead again in life. So from Pierre Trudeau's belief in the power of the state to Mulroney's bet on free markets, from Chrétien's brutal war on the deficit to Harper's steady conservatism, and back to Justin Trudeau's philosophy of generational investment, the pendulum of Canadian fiscal policy has swung widely over about 5 decades, and our journey through the numbers reveal a clear pattern. The first Trudeau left a legacy of social programs, but a mountain of debt. Mulroney started the hard work of restructuring. Chrétien and Martin made the painful choice to pay the bills, creating a period of fiscal stability that Harper largely maintained. And the second Trudeau swung the pendulum right back, gambling that massive deficits can build a more prosperous and equitable Canada. But this time, the global environment is far less forgiving than the first time. Each leader made choices based on their vision, but those choices have consequences that echo for decades and even until now. The budgets of the past built the Canada of today with all its strengths and all of its financial pressures and weaknesses. Now the question is, what will our budgets build for tomorrow? And will the next generation be paying for our promises or reaping their rewards? Well, I want to know what you think about this monologue this time. What part of this history surprised you the most? If you lived through these eras, I actually want to hear from you in the comment section. If you lived through all these prime ministers, what did life look like for you? What did affordability look like during each one of these prime ministers? And if you got any value from this episode, please support the effort on this channel by simply clicking on the subscribe button, give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, share it on social media, and I'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.